Guys, um, yeah. So, anyway, I don't really need to restate the question because it's in the title of the video. Am I just a chemical in my brain? I think it's an interesting question, and it reveals a very interesting. It's a question that then reveals more questions, and it's a very complex issue, or at least it's an interesting issue, if not complex. Although I think it might be legitimately complex, but in any case, irrespective of my word choices there. Am I just a chemical in my brain? Or what is I? And where does self reside? And last night, I, I asked that question legitimately curious about whether I'm anything more than neurobiology and whether humans are anything more than their own neurobiology, neurophysiology, neuroelectricity, any of these things. So, what are we? What is the self? Where does it come from? And am I just a chemical in my brain? And it entirely depends on the, I suppose, the issue of where the self comes from. And whether, if you're a materialist, then you take the view that self is produced by the brain and consciousness is produced by the brain, the physical brain. It's a physical emergent. It's an emergent property of a physical process. And when I ask the question to, or you might be a person that is non materialist with respect to the self, you might think that there is such a thing as a soul, or that, so yeah, and that's a very basic distinction there. And it really depends on your own metaphysical outlook with regard to what the self is and what I is and where it comes from. And personally, I'm more of a materialist in that regard, but I'm also my position with regard to where the self comes from is not purely materialistic. Um, when I asked the question to my friend, "Am I just a chemical in my brain?" He said, "No, you are a process that arises from or is related to the chemicals in your brain or the activities of the physical brain, the chemical activities, the electrical activities, and you're a process that arises out of those sub processes, right? So you're sort of a, so in this sense, he's basically saying that I am an emergent property. I am not the thing in of itself. Consciousness is an emergent property. The self is an emergent property of the mind. And personally, I think that mind is merely an emergent property of the processes, the scientific processes, the physical processes in the material physical brain. That mind is an emergent property of brain. And in this sense, one can be a materialist. One can have a very materialist view of the self and of I, and at the same time have a metaphysical view of the self and I, in the sense that I am not just a chemical in my brain. I am an emergent property of all of the chemical biological processes happening in the physical brain. I'm an emergent property of all of those things, culminating in an emergency that we call consciousness, identity, and self. However, it's still very interesting to wonder if, for instance, with antidepressants in neuropharmacology, we look at how, you know, upping serotonin might produce more feelings of well being. In many ways, I read, or at least I'd heard, I'm not exactly sure what study I draw this from, but it's more or less the idea that when certain, sea life, marine life, like certain types of let's call them at this point. I'm just going to call it, certain marine microbes or certain kinds of primitive marine life, when they're exposed to some of the chemicals and antidepressants, instead of hiding, continuing to do what they normally do to survive, which is to hide under a rock and avoid predators, they will react differently when exposed to this pharmacological influence. And instead of hiding under the rock, which is their basic strategy of avoiding predators and achieving survival, they will come out from under the rock when exposed to the antidepressants, to the SSRIs, and they will float to the surface. So they will display a reduction in inhibition. Um, they will they will, instead of hiding under the rock, they'll come out from under the rock and they'll explore the surrounding territory. And so it even happens with primitive life in that way. And so when, in the same way that when humans, right, are exposed to this pharmacological influence from the antidepressants, they begin to exhibit similar effects. Of course, translating across the the neurophysiology from primitive marine life to a human is, of course, an issue that's fraught with difficulty. Whether we can extrapolate across contexts in that way and say they react in the same way we do is more or less an issue that's pretty fraught with some very with it's suspect. It's fraught with a lot of very contingent and it's fraught with ambiguity. Whether you can, Jordan Peterson references the idea that lobsters, operate on the same serotonergic um, neurophysiology, and that, when they achieve dominance, they achieve a certain role within the dominance hierarchy. Their serotonin levels go up, and they take on more. They fight more for mates, so they exhibit changes in their physiology as the result of their new positioning in a dominance hierarchy. That's Jordan Peterson's idea. Of course, what I'm saying is that many would question whether we can extrapolate from lobsters to humans, whether there's a legitimate biological similarity there in the way that we respond, that we operate on the serotonergic um, circuits or receptors. There may be differences in how serotonin affects different life forms, right? So it's same chemical, different effects because different life forms. Now, you know, but when humans are exposed to have this pharmacological influence from antidepressants, they can often express different traits. And like, the primitive marine life coming out from under the rock and exploring the outer territory, humans can begin to express different psychological traits and behaviors as the result of this pharmacological influence. And so, you give a person, a depressed or anxious person, an antidepressant, they start maybe doing being affected by them in similar ways, climb out from under the rock, and then begin to explore a little bit more. Um, and So, in that sense, are they just chemicals in their brain, right? Because clearly, a change in that chemistry is the result of the ingestion of the antidepressant. Seems to indicate that in many ways our traits are biologically determined and physiologically determined, and our behaviors are often physiologically determined as well. So, are we just these sort of deterministic, you know, are we just these kinds of um, are we puppets of our own chemistry, or are we something more? Is there something more there? And clearly there's more. I mean, you know, uh, traits and behaviors and abilities probably are a lot related to neuroanatomy and neurointerconnectivity and all of these other factors. And of course, I'm not saying that it's just a matter of chemistry, but it's to say that chemistry plays a role in that process. And if I were to take an antidepressant and change my or my physiology in some way, well, then I begin to express different traits. I become a different person in that sense. So, how much is our identity linked to physiology? I mean, this is a legitimate question, and it's not one that people really want to explore because they want to think that there's something more than mere chemistry. But you know, again, the evidence is that these types of pharmacological influences in the form of SSRIs and antidepressants can cause humans to develop different behaviors and express different traits, maybe a reduction in inhibition. And so, in many ways, when they're under the influence of this, pharmacological influence, you know, would are they anything more than their own chemistry? Does that not demonstrate that because the pharmacology affects different traits and behaviors, does that not indicate that chemistry plays a role in who they are? And really that's the only question I'm asking. But, it seems to me that in many ways, our behaviors and traits are chemically determined, and this has to play a role in the great process that is the self and the mind and the identity and consciousness and everything else. Terence McKenna, I'm not. I guess I'm a pseudo psychonaut. I'm not a committed psychonaut. I don't really encourage the use of psychedelics, and I definitely do not encourage them. Right. I expressly forbid it for myself because they're dangerous, and I do not recommend it for anyone else because they come with immense risks. But regardless, it all goes back to the question of how identity and self and consciousness is linked to our neurophysiology. And, this is a very, very interesting, you know, intersection of a lot of different disciplines. It's an area where philosophy and biology kind of intersect, where we're having these discussions about the phenomenology of the self and of identity and of all of that. And we try to get deeper into where that comes from because I mean it's much more rational, I think, to begin as a materialist with regard to the self and consciousness to a certain extent, depending on what you mean by materialism. I mean, prior to advancements in the development of materialist perspectives on reality and the self, we thought that we had souls, or that humans were perhaps spiritual beings, and there was something more to what causes to things causally than just chemistry, biology, and the physical forces of nature operating on particles, producing superstructures of particles that then give rise to emergent properties of mind and identity and self. And but we have to start with the material, you know. But prior to our thinking on evolution, for example, we thought that creationism ruled the day, perhaps. But again, it's far scientifically we must start with the material world as our basis for examining the causes of things and developing a scientific understandings of things. Now, I'm not a I I'm not an advocate of scientism, and I recognize that science has its limitations and that materialism has its limitations. But to me, it's more rational, it's more empirical. If rationality is defined by some commitment to empiricism, then we'd have to start with the material world and material factors to an extent in trying to develop an understanding of things. And it's just where to begin. It's Now, here's the thing. As a materialist, you can still believe in metaphysical phenomena. There are emergent properties of things. All of the cells in my body combined together, none of which are conscious. None of the cells are conscious enough themselves. None of them have self or identity. None of them are conscious. But combined together in a particular structure, consciousness and self arise. So, if you can still believe in metaphysical emergent properties, even while being a materialist. And so, you know, being a materialist doesn't exclude an acknowledgement of the reality of the metaphysical, and consciousness seems to be one of these things. One of these, consciousness and the self definitely seem to be one of these emergent properties that are very metaphysical in nature, although they may arise from purely materialistic or purely materialist forces of the physical universe and of reality, etc., etc. So, it's definitely an interesting question. Um, as to, I harkens back to some of the ideas that were covered in one study performed by some aspiring, well, everyone's heard about, with regard to this discussion, everyone's heard about the scientist, or rather, I'll just call him an empiricist. Well, not much of an empiricist if he believed in souls. Tried to measure whether after death the body weighed less because the soul left the vessel. And so, um, and so that's, I guess, not really a study, he didn't really have a very good, from what I know, the parameters of his particular study as to whether after death there is a demonstrable decrease in weight as the result of the soul escaping the vessel, um, and leaving the vessel after death. I don't know what the parameters of his particular study was. From what I know, he only weighed a couple of corpses. Um, Even still, a decrease in weight after death, you know, could very easily be explained by other factors, loss of fluid uh, being one. So, this is definitely an important point as well, but it goes back to this idea of the soul and whether the self is anything more than these materialist forces of nature, um, operating together and confluencing in a particular way that ultimately culminates in a very mysterious emergent property uh, that we can't readily grasp or understand. I like the quote from Alan Watts, which is that, trying to understand the self and trying to understand how we think and the phenomenology of thought and of self and of identity, it's like trying to bite your own teeth. You know, um, it's the brain trying to understand itself. And can that even be done if we're only operating if we're operating from the point of view of how the brain functions? So, in any case, am I just a chemical in my own brain is a very reductive question, and it ultimately amounts to a kind of attempt at humor. But regardless, it's still an interesting question, and it implicates a number of other subjects from recent discourse, or at least uh, points made in recent discourse on the subject. And again, the topics raised in this video philosophically don't amount to any new. I'm not presenting any radically new areas of thought, um, but it's still an interesting question, and it's one that I would encourage my viewers to ponder. Thank you for watching.